In January of 1894, 3 men who owned most of the gold coming out of Colorado made a decision they thought would go unnoticed. The place was Cripple Creek, a mining district that 3 years earlier hadn't existed at all. They posted a notice, 1 sentence. The workday was changing, 8 hours to 10, same pay. They didn't expect an answer. Mine owners rarely got one. But 6 weeks later, one of those men was pulled from his own horse-drawn cart, in broad daylight surrounded, his armed guards taken with him by miners who'd had enough of being told what their time was worth. Before the year was out, a sitting governor did something no American governor had done before, or has since, sent the state militia not to break a strike, but to protect the men who were striking. This is the story of Cripple Creek, Colorado, 1893 to 1894. Not the gold, the war over who got to keep it. This isn't reconstructed for drama. The mine, the photographer, the date, all catalogued. Every name in this video is a real documented person. Mine owners, union officers, a governor, a general. Sources are in the description, timestamped to the claim. To understand how a wage notice ended with a governor arming himself against his own state sheriffs, you have to go back to before there was a district to fight over at all, back to the man who found the gold nobody else wanted. In 1891, a half-hearted cattle rancher named Bob Womack found gold on a hillside near Pikes Peak that everybody else had already written off. The area had a reputation, and not a good one. Cattlemen used it for grazing because nothing else about it seemed worth the trouble. Earlier prospectors had passed through decades before, found nothing worth staking, and moved on. And that verdict had more or less stuck for 30 years. Womack didn't care what the verdict had been. He'd spent years digging test holes on his own time, mostly ignored or laughed at by neighbours who thought he was wasting a good ranch on a bad hobby. He staked a claim on what became the Crescent Vein, and within 2 years, nobody was laughing. The geology turned out to be almost freakishly rich, not scattered placer gold that panned out in a season, but deep, persistent ore bodies that kept paying as shafts went deeper. That's the detail that separates Cripple Creek from most gold rushes, which tend to burn hot and die fast. This one kept producing, which meant it kept attracting people, capital, and eventually the kind of large-scale industrial mining operations that create the conditions for a labour war, absentee owners, hired superintendents, and a workforce large enough that nobody at the top knew the men underground by name. By 1893, more than 150 mines were operating across a district that included Cripple Creek, Victor, Altman, Anaconda, and Independence. Surface gold that had been discovered just 2 years earlier was now supporting a working population in the thousands. It was, by any measure, one of the fastest boomtowns the American West had ever produced. And that speed is exactly what would make it so violent. A camp that grows that fast doesn't have time to build trust. It just builds mines. The people running them and the people digging in them were strangers to each other from day one, and that gap never closed. Keep that in mind. It matters later, when a governor has to decide who to believe. Then, in the summer of 1893, the rest of the country's economy fell apart. Historians call it the Panic of 1893, one of the worst depressions in American history to that point. Banks failed. Railroads went bankrupt, and silver, which had been propping up mining economies across the Rockies, crashed in price almost overnight. Gold, unlike silver, held its value. So while silver camps across Colorado were shutting down and laying off thousands, Cripple Creek's gold mines kept running and became the only place in the region still hiring. That's the part most retellings skip. This wasn't a labor dispute that happened in isolation. It was the collision of a national financial collapse with one boomtown that was, by accident of geology, still standing when almost everything around it had fallen. To understand how severe that collapse actually was, The Panic of 1893 triggered the failure of hundreds of banks and more than 15,000 businesses nationwide within a single year. Unemployment in some industrial regions climbed past 20%. Entire mining towns across the Rockies places that had been thriving 18 months earlier emptied out almost overnight once silver stopped being profitable to pull out of the ground. Leadville, once one of the richest silver camps in the country, saw thousands of miners laid off within weeks of the crash. Every one of those unemployed men heard the same rumor: Cripple Creek was still hiring. And they came, on foot, by wagon, by whatever rail line was still running, because it was the only rumor in the region that turned out to be true. Miners poured in from the dead silver camps from Leadville, from Aspen, from towns that no longer had work to offer. Labour flooded a market that, a year earlier, had been desperate for hands, and a flooded labour market is the one thing that always tempts an owner to push. 3 names sit at the centre of what happened next: J.J. Hagerman, David Moffat, and Eben Smith. Between them, these 3 men employed roughly a third of every miner working the district. That's not a majority, but it was enough leverage to set the terms everyone else would be forced to match. In January of 1894, these 3 owners announced the change. The workday would go from 8 hours to 10, with the daily wage frozen at $3. In today's terms, that's roughly the same as telling a workforce they'd be doing 25% more labour for the exact same paycheck and offering no room to negotiate. On February 1st, 1894, the 10-hour day went into effect at those mines. It's worth pausing on that date, because it's the moment the clock on this entire war started ticking. The miners weren't unorganised. Since 1893, they'd already formed something called the Free Coinage Union, based out of the town of Altman on Bull Hill. When the 10-hour notice went up, that union folded into a larger, more radical organisation that had only just been founded the year before. In the aftermath of a brutal, spy-infiltrated strike in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, the Western Federation of Miners. Cripple Creek's chapter became its Local 19. This detail matters more than it sounds like it should. The WFM wasn't born in comfort. It was born inside a prison camp 600 miners held for 4 months after that Idaho strike collapsed. The men who organised Cripple Creek's union had learned, the hard way, exactly what mine owners were willing to do to break a strike. That memory would shape every decision the union made over the next 5 months. We'll come back to it. Coeur d'Alene, the strike that produced the WFM in the first place, is worth a sentence of its own context, because it explains the paranoia that Cripple Creek's union carried with it from day one. In that Idaho conflict, mine owners had planted informants inside the union leadership itself, men who reported every planned action back to management before it happened. When the strike still went ahead anyway, several miners were killed by hired guards, and the territorial governor called in federal troops, who rounded up hundreds of Union men and held them in a bullpen enclosure for months without formal charges. It was, by any standard, a total defeat for organised labour, and it's the exact blueprint the Cripple Creek miners were determined not to repeat. Every fortification they built on Bull Hill, every precaution they took about who they let into Union meetings, traces back to what happened in that Idaho bullpen. Union President John Calderwood gave the mine owners 1 week. Reinstate the 8-hour day at $3, or the men walk. The owners didn't answer. The men walked on February 7th, 1894. The strike had begun. Some of the smaller operations folded almost immediately: the Portland, the Pikes Peak. The Gold Dollar mine among them agreeing to the 8-hour terms and staying open. But the big operators, the ones with the most to lose and the most leverage, held out. And by the end of February, every smelter processing Cripple Creek ore was either closed outright or running on a skeleton schedule. The strike wasn't staying contained to the mines. It was choking the entire supply chain built around them. That's an important mechanical detail, because it's what turned a wage dispute into something the owners couldn't simply wait out. A mine that isn't being worked loses no ore, the gold stays in the ground, unspent but not destroyed. A smelter sitting idle is a different problem entirely. Smelting contracts, freight arrangements and processing schedules were all built around continuous throughput, and every week those facilities sat quiet, cost real money, moving in the wrong direction. By early March, that pressure had already cracked two of the larger operations, the Gold King and the Granite Mines, both of which broke ranks with the other owners and reinstated the 8-hour day just to get their ore moving again. The union hadn't beaten the whole district yet, but it had proven within a month that the strike could bite. This is where the story stops looking like a normal labour dispute. The miners didn't just walk off the job and wait. On Bull Hill, above Altman, they built defensive works trenches, timber barricades, lookout positions. They weren't preparing to negotiate. They were preparing to hold ground, because they expected, correctly, that force was coming. Remember what we said about the WFM being founded in a prison camp? This is why. These men had already watched a sister union get crushed by exactly this kind of standoff. They weren't going to be caught unarmed twice. Life on Bull Hill during those weeks wasn't romantic. Men who'd spent their working lives underground were now sleeping in trenches through a Colorado spring. Rationing food brought up by sympathetic townspeople, and drilling in makeshift militia formations under officers who had, in some cases, learned tactics from actual military service years earlier. Union scouts kept watch on the roads leading up from Colorado Springs and Colorado City. Everyone on that hill had the same read on where trouble would come from, and they weren't wrong. The most striking single event of the entire strike happened in this stretch, and it's the one detail almost nobody outside Colorado history circles knows. A mine superintendent, the man who had finally succeeded, after repeated attempts, in getting the district's major owners to agree on the 10-hour shift, was making his usual commute from Cripple Creek, flanked by 2 armed deputy sheriffs, one riding ahead of his cart and one behind. As he passed the Doherty boarding house, a crowd of men stepped into the road and stopped him cold. Before he understood what was happening, a second group closed off his escape from behind. His 2 armed guards were captured along with him. That's the detail worth sitting with. This wasn't a raid or an ambush that ended in gunfire. It was a coordinated, disciplined act by men who wanted to make a point without giving the state a reason to escalate. It worked for a while. The superintendent was released. But the message had been sent. The union controlled the ground now, not the owners. That message reached the governor's office. Davis Hanson Waite was 67 years old, a populist, and unusually for the time openly sympathetic to organised labour. He'd been swept into office 2 years earlier on a wave of agrarian and labour discontent that was reshaping politics across the American West, part of a broader populist movement that distrusted concentrated industrial wealth on principle. That worldview wasn't incidental to what happened next. It's the reason Cripple Creek strike played out so differently from almost every other major American labour conflict of the era. A governor who saw mine owners as the more dangerous party in this dispute was, at the time, close to unheard of. When local authorities and mine owners demanded troops to crush the strike, Waite did send troops. But he sent them under Adjutant General T.J. Tarsney, with instructions that would have been unthinkable in almost any other American labour conflict of the era: keep the peace, and do not assume the strikers are the threat. Tarsney arrived expecting chaos. What he found was a district that was tense, armed, but quiet. Union President Calderwood personally assured him the men would cooperate, even offering to surrender to arrest if it came to that. Tarsney came away convinced that the level of danger being reported to the governor by the county sheriff had been badly exaggerated, and recommended pulling the troops back rather than using them against the strikers. That recommendation did not sit well with everyone. Local mine owners and the county sheriff, a man named Bowers, had been telling the governor's office a very different story than the one Tarsney was now reporting back, one that emphasised armed insurrection and imminent danger to the town's civilian population. Tarsney's on-the-ground assessment directly contradicted that account, and it put him at odds with the very people who had the most influence over how this conflict would end. Owners versus general, that's the fault line the entire second half of this story runs along, and it's about to split the state's own forces against each other. While Tarsney was recommending restraint, El Paso County's sheriff was building his own force, a large civilian posse. Deputized outside the Union's control, made up largely of men with no connection to the mining district at all. Some accounts from the period put the number of deputized men in the hundreds, recruited in part from among transient labourers and unemployed men passing through the region, men who had no stake in the district's future either way, and who were being paid effectively. To end a strike they had no personal grievance with, a private mobilisation operating under county authority rather than the governor's, that's what this was, and it carried a very different mandate than Tarsney's troops. Break the strike by force if necessary. It's the structural problem that made the summer of 1894 so dangerous, two armed state-adjacent forces in the same small district, operating under contradictory instructions, with a fortified Union encampment sitting between them. This is the moment the story stops being a standoff and becomes a genuine armed conflict. To grasp how volatile that made things, the posse wasn't a small show of force. Contemporary accounts describe recruitment drives in Denver and Colorado Springs that pulled in men with no mining background and, in some cases, no fixed employment at all paid a day rate to carry a rifle up a mountain toward men who, unlike them, actually had something at stake. That imbalance is worth sitting with. On one side of the line stood miners defending their own livelihoods and their own hillside. On the other stood a hired force, with nothing personal riding on the outcome at all, backed by owners who very much did. In June of 1894, that convergence turned deadly. An explosion tore through the strong mine, one of the operations at the centre of the dispute, killing several men in the blast. Accounts from the period differ on exactly who was responsible and precisely how it happened, and this episode won't pretend to resolve that dispute for you. What isn't disputed is that the explosion happened, that lives were lost, and that it pushed the conflict to a breaking point that finally forced a resolution. By the time the standoff finally broke, the Union had achieved something almost no labour action of that era managed: total victory on its own terms. The 8-hour day at $3 was reinstated across the district. The owners who had held out the longest were the ones who conceded. The final settlement, brokered in the aftermath of the strong mine explosion, restored the 8-hour day across every major mine in the district, a complete reversal of the January notice that had started the whole conflict 5 months earlier. For an American labour dispute in the 1890s, an era when strikes were far more often crushed than won, that outcome was genuinely rare. But the more lasting consequence wasn't local. Word of what had happened at Cripple Creek, a union that fought a sheriff's posse to a standstill and still won its demands, spread through mining camps across the American West. Over the following decade, the Western Federation of Miners grew from a single embattled local into an organisation with more than 200 locals across 13 states. The 8-hour day at $3 a shift became something close to a regional standard other camps used as their own baseline demand, and Cripple Creek itself became something like a founding legend for the Union proof. Repeated in meeting halls from Montana to Idaho, that a mining district could stand up to its owners and come out ahead. None of that erased the underlying tension, though. The same conditions that produced the 1894 war absentee owners, a workforce with no personal relationship to the men setting its wages, and a boom that had outrun any shared sense of trust, never really went away. They just went quiet for a decade. Go back to what we said at the start, that this camp grew too fast to build trust between the men who owned the mines and the men who worked them. That gap is exactly what let a company town become a battlefield in the first place. And it's why the resolution mattered beyond Cripple Creek itself. It was proof, for the first time in that region, that the gap could be forced closed from the workers' side without the state simply crushing them for trying. The peace didn't last forever. A decade later, in 1903 and 1904, the same district would erupt again, this time far more violently, and with a very different outcome for the Union. That second conflict would involve a governor far less sympathetic than Waite. A private detective agency hired specifically to break the WFM, and a level of bloodshed that made 1894 look almost restrained by comparison. Some of the same names, some of the same family fortunes built on those same mines would resurface a decade later on the opposite side of the outcome. That's a different story, for a different episode. What makes 1894 worth telling on its own is precisely that it didn't end that way. It's a labour conflict from one of the most anti-union decades in American history that the workers actually won, cleanly, with a governor on their side instead of against them. Historians who study this period point to Cripple Creek in 1894 specifically because it doesn't fit the pattern, and stories that don't fit the pattern are usually the ones worth understanding in detail, rather than filing away as just another strike that happened a long time ago in a mining town most people have never heard of. But 1894 stands on its own. It's one of the only times in American history a sitting governor sided militarily with strikers over mine owners. It's one of the only strikes where miners captured an armed escort without firing a shot. And it's a reminder that the most dramatic history doesn't always need embellishment. Cripple Creek in 1893 and 1894 didn't need a hidden vault or a welded shut tunnel to be a story worth telling. It just needed someone to tell it straight. Every claim in this video is sourced and timestamped in the description below. Union records, state archives, and first-hand accounts, not folklore. If you want the district's next chapter, the far bloodier strike of 1903, let us know in the comments, and we'll go there next. We follow traces, not theories. See you in the next one.